Hey, grade sevens, welcome to lesson 3.3, the British colonies in Atlantic Canada. Why did the British come here and how did they affect the history of Canada? So stick around and let's learn something. What role did Britain play in colonizing the land we now call Canada? Welcome, grade sevens. This is lesson 3.3, the British colonies in Atlantic Canada. And you can see here I've got a map of North America, and you can see the different colors that we have here. We have some land belonging, and I'm using air quotations again, belonging to the French, because as the French explored, they claimed land for France. We also have a color representing Great Britain, and then we also have a color that we don't have a legend on here, but it's Spain further down in the south. Now, France was exploring and claiming land as they kind of headed into the interior, and you can see on this map, you can see the French names that were given to these places as they went by. And Britain was also exploring the exact same area. And when we talk about Atlantic Canada, the British are settling Newfoundland and Halifax. A newfound land. Newfoundland. Giovanni Caboto, John Cabot, he reached Newfoundland in the year 1497. In 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue, and when word reached that they had found this land, that they discovered this route, what they thought was eventually Asia, but it wasn't. This sparked a lot of chatter and talk in Europe. And when John Cabot, Giovanni Caboto, he came by around Newfoundland in 1497, he could throw a bucket in the water and he could scoop up all this cod. So it was like super, super easy. When the Europeans heard about all of this abundance of fish, they were like, okay, we need to go there ourselves. We need to fish there. Because for many Europeans, especially those who were Catholics, fish was a very important staple of their diet. So now we have off the coast of Newfoundland, we have hundreds of ships coming off of the shore of Newfoundland to fish. And then, because a lot of them were mainly British, well, Newfoundland is now going to be claimed as British. But they are not going to make a settlement there at first because the climate is super harsh and the soil wasn't very good to farm. So from a British point of view, this is not something that we want to invest too much time in. They did come ashore, and they did so that they could dry their catch, prep their ships for the voyage back to England. So they did come ashore. Eventually, though, as it was becoming more and more popular, groups of these fishing fleets would stay behind to secure the best harbors for the next season, for the next fishing season. So they would stay behind in the wintertime. And slowly, the population begins to grow. And then eventually, this handsome individual right here on the right-hand side, King George II, he grants captains permission to build villages there on Newfoundland. And then eventually, so a long time later, because 1457 is when John Cabot first makes his arrival there, in 1729, Newfoundland finally becomes a colony under the British Empire. But who was already living there? Well, First Nations, obviously, were living there. The Beothuk were living in Newfoundland. And in the summer times, they would make their way to the coast where they would be fishing. And then in the wintertime, they would be moving inland and following the caribou hunt. Well, as you can imagine, the arrival of the British is not going to be coinciding with the life of the Beothuk. And the British disrupted that way of life because the British were taking the best harbors, which means that the access to water, the access to the fishing stocks are going to now be blocked. And that means that the Beothuk have to then compete with the British for food. Now, in terms of military technology, the British are going to have the advantage. They've got guns and gunpowder. So right there, that is going to keep the Beothuk away from the British as much as possible. So even though they tried to avoid the British, once the British left to go back to England after they did their summer catch or whatever, then the Beothuk in the wintertime, they would come and raid those fishing stations once the British left. Well, you can imagine what the British are going to feel like when they arrive back, and now those stations that they thought were going to survive the winter have now been destroyed. Well, the British, with their guns, they are going to retaliate against the Beothuk, as well as they will be introducing European diseases. And we talk a lot more about European diseases later on in grade 7, and we talk a lot about it in grade 8 social studies as well. So anyways, the British are now there, and then by the year 1828, there's only one Beothuk person remaining, a young Beothuk woman, and she lived with an English family in St. John's. And the English people that were living there, they were super interested in her, and they developed this interest in her and her people. She would draw pictures to explain her culture, to explain the Beothuk way of life. But unfortunately, in 1829, she dies of tuberculosis. And within 200 years of the arrival of the British at Newfoundland, we see an extinction of one of our First Nations people. So really sad part of Canadian history. And it kind of brings in that whole ethnocentrism concept that we talked about in chapter 1, where the Europeans thought that they were better than everybody else. The colonies that eventually develop in North America, they are affected by events that are taking place in Europe. And the two big superpowers at the time were France and England. And those two were always, it seems, they were constantly at war. So if they were at war in Europe, well, then guess what? That war would spill over into their North American colonies. But in the year 1713, the Treaty of Utrecht was signed in Europe, and it created peace in Europe. But because the colonies are still part of these European empires, the colonies were divided up as well. And you can see here on these two maps how North America was divided before the Treaty of Utrecht and then after the treaty in 1713. And long story short, the Treaty of 1713 allowed the French to keep a fortress that they had in Louisbourg, which is on Cape Breton. It gave Acadia, if you remember Acadia from chapter 2, it gave all of Acadia to the British. The British renamed Acadia to Nova Scotia, which still exists today. It's one of our provinces. But the British, they had a heart, so they let the habitants live there. But they only let them live there for a while. As you can imagine, in this part of our story, we are going to be getting ready to talk about death, disease, and destruction in a few lessons. And this destruction of Acadia is going to be happening here in a few lessons. So now the British have Nova Scotia. Well, what should we do? Well, we're going to create the city of Halifax. The French were still allowed to keep that fortress in Louisbourg, which is in Cape Breton. And this is kind of concerning for the British. They're a little bit worried about this fortress. It's a fortress. What kind of words come to mind when you think of fortress, right? Fortified, strong, powerful. These are the kinds of words that are going to come to mind when you think of the word fortress. So what ends up happening is the British really tightened their control of Nova Scotia in 1749. So they've been doing this for many, many years. But in 1749, they finally say, hey, you know what? We're going to show the French who's boss. So the British, they go and they plan to build a town and a fort in the biggest harbor that is in the province of Nova Scotia. Okay, and it's Halifax is what they create, and eventually it becomes a naval base. And 16 ships make their way in, 2,600 soldiers and colonists, they make their way in, and they're really trying to show this British presence to the French, who have their fortress in Louisbourg. Now we're setting up, okay, we got a fortress there, and the British are now going to make a fort in Halifax. You can kind of see, there's some foreshadowing here. You can tell what's going to be happening. They named this settlement Halifax because the person who was in charge of this of the creation of the settlement was named Halifax. So they named it after him. And the houses and buildings were built along the waterfront, and then they've built a fortress at the top of the hill. Why would you build a fortress on top of a hill? Well, if you play any video games, you know the answer to that. It's easy to defend. You can see people coming from quite a distance away, so you've got this strategic advantage over your enemies. So now we've got a settlement in Halifax. We've got this fortress in Halifax. A settlement means that people are coming over, and the citizens of Halifax were controlled by a government that included a governor, a council, a group of council members, and an elected assembly. Now, here's the problem. The governor made all the decisions and held off on having an assembly. So this was for quite a long time. This was for almost 10 years. They held off having these elections, but they're supposed to have elections. So the home country, Britain, England, they force Nova Scotia and Halifax to have an election in 1758, and this is the very first elected assembly in British North America. So this is like the vote in Canada. This is huge. This is an important date. You'll never be tested on this date, but if you're following along in our story of Canada in Canadian history, this is a pretty important date. This is our first elected assembly in British North America. Now, we've got the British there. We've got the French there. But guess who else is in Nova Scotia? I'll give you a second to think about it. If you remembered from chapter 1, the Mi'kmaq were in present-day Nova Scotia. And they were very concerned about the British. Okay? Halifax was created on land that was preferred by the Mi'kmaq. So they had taken away the access to the water, to fishing, and all that kind of stuff. The Mi'kmaq, as we remember from chapter 1 and chapter 2, they were allies with the French. And the French were still living in Nova Scotia at the time, remember? Because the British, through the Treaty of Utrecht, allowed the French to live there, to still stay there. And the French were, they were urging the Mi'kmaq to make British life as difficult as possible. Okay? So go raid the farms, go wreck this, go kill these animals, do that. And they were egging on the Mi'kmaq to make life very uncomfortable for the British that were there. So then the British governor of the time there, Lord Cornwall, this is what he orders. And he says that he wants the British, the citizens that are living there, to annoy, distress, take or destroy Mi'kmaq people wherever they are found. And we see this order coming down, and then the citizens are following through, and they're following through with the orders from Lord Cornwall, and they're attacking the Mi'kmaq. And we've seen this before. We've seen this instead of making peace and coming to some sort of agreement, we see that the British are quick to arms, and they are going and attacking the First Nations that are living there. While this is happening, Halifax is no longer a safe place to build outside of that immediate town that's there. So going into the interior of Nova Scotia and moving away from Halifax is no longer a good idea. And not only is it not safe, but the good farmland that is there, the Acadians have that good farmland. And they were allowed to stay there because of that treaty, and they were the Mi'kmaq allies. So now the British and the colonists that are living there, who are British, are not feeling safe to go beyond Halifax. And obviously, you can see it in the foreshadowing here. The situation is going to become very tense between the French and the British. And any kind of hope or idea for peace is going to become threatened. And we will see what happens there in later lessons with the Acadians and the British in Nova Scotia. All right, what I want you to do now is head over to your notebook and complete the questions for this part of the chapter.